Good morning, everyone. This is Don Gulling, CEO of Vertex Consulting. We appreciate you joining us today. We've got a great speaker and some excellent content, and I'm confident that you all leave this session feeling better informed and have some additional tools potentially to address this alarming increase that we see still today in cyber attacks around the world. A couple of things about the webinar, just so everyone knows. Number one, we are recording this webinar, so we will post it after a quick edit. We will post it on our YouTube channel. All of our webinars, even the ones from years ago, are also posted out there, so we encourage you to either subscribe or look at them. We have a lot of technical training content. All the webinars we do, we try to always focus on an educational aspect and not a sales pitch. So hopefully you find that when you watch the other ones. I think that if you go through them, you'll see there's a lot of valuable content in there. And it's not, trying to sell you something. That's not really the goal here. We have seen an alarming increase in cybercrime, and we see it in the news daily. I was just mentioning today to one of our colleagues that a data center in Sweden was hit with an Akira ransomware attack on their Linux servers. It's a $3 billion per year company. So it's a major data center, 24,000 employees, very sophisticated cybersecurity capabilities internally, trying to do all the right things. I'm sure there are people who are trying to be secure as they can be, but in the kind of press release about the attack, they said that it could take weeks or months to recover some of these environments. And that's the stuff that we hear about. These high profile attacks, they get published. Not all of them, right? But some of them. Small business attacks or medium business attacks, often those don't get published, and they are by far much more common. In addition to attacks like ransomware, we're also seeing a skyrocketing a number of attacks via business email compromise, where hackers are getting into Office 365 or on-site email environments and then using intel via the web, LinkedIn, Facebook, your own website to find out who the right people are, getting into an accounts payable email or getting into an AR email and working through this to get someone on either side of a transaction to change ACH routing. And it may seem far-fetched, but I'm telling you, there's not a week that goes by that we don't get a call from somebody that found us on Google that they lost money. I mean, we had one last month, $1 million ACH gone. The very next day, a fuel company, $75,000 ACH gone. A week later, somebody, $260,000 ACH. All these were business email compromises. So that's also something that we need to keep an eye on. Last couple of things, and then I'll introduce our guest speaker, Rui Lopes. Almost all of these attacks, almost all of them, once you do the forensics, we find they originate by and large on the endpoint. And the reason is either through targeted phishing, like a spear phishing attack, or through sophisticated social engineering, or from SMS attacks. All those things, and then of course you've got the ever-present issues with the browser security and drive-by downloads from websites that have been hacked. All that stuff is causing the endpoint to really be the epicenter of our cybersecurity efforts. And we need to obviously look at our perimeter and have firewalls, and all those things, are still absolutely critical. But hackers have realized that it's a lot easier, essentially, to get in via the endpoint. So with that in mind, one thing is really crystal clear, and that's we need a new approach. And the only answer is zero trust. And we're going to talk about what that means, and we're also going to show you some of these tools. And there's a theory behind it, and I'll let Rui tell you that. But zero trust to me is really the only way to go, and you'll know why when we cover that. Our guest speaker, Rui Lopes, is the senior technical evangelist, works for WatchGuard. Rui's been in the cybersecurity industry for almost 20 years. He spent 15 or so years of that time at Panda Security, working on endpoint protection platforms in Europe and globally. WatchGuard acquired Panda Security about 4 years ago and has since rolled out new tools based on that platform called WatchGuard Endpoint Protection, Detection and Response. There's also WatchGuard XDR, AuthPoint. I'm sure you heard some of these names, but all this security suite kind of all works together. Rui is also a certified ethical hacker That's something he did a couple of years ago just to expand his expertise and knowledge base. And he's a wealth of information. I'm sure you're going to enjoy hearing from him. That said, I'll turn it over to you, Rui, our guest speaker. Thank you again for joining us.
Thank you, Don, for having me. Off to our agenda. So we're going to talk in the course of describing the evolution of threats and the sophistication of threats that we're dealing with, and actually, to put it in simple words, putting our money on in our endpoint protection model. We're going to associate that actually with the evolution of endpoint protection, a bit of the history of endpoint protection and how we got from, and Don, you already mentioned it, from that trust and verify world that over the years, in the course of almost, or actually more than 30 years, put the antivirus or endpoint security industry into trouble, going from trust to verify to systems that actually are based on the zero trust model today. And we're going to look at that also in the context of how we, WatchGuard, built our endpoint protection model, which is based on a combination of two services that are built in to the way we deliver protection, or in the way we deliver our products, our solutions to every endpoint, and are part of the strategy to deal with, on one end, file-based malware, on the other end, as I like to describe it, everything else. And everything else is the important component these days that we're going to associate with the sophistication of the current threat landscape. One is the Zero Trust Application Service. The Zero Trust Application Service is aimed at solving the problem, like I mentioned, of file-based malware, and the threat hunting service is focused on a more sophisticated kind of attack that leverages living off the land vectors, fileless, malwareless components. Then we're going to jump from the protection model to how, informationally, in the sequence of describing the protection model, how we deliver that protection model within our portfolio of solutions, and how we can extend that, or we can extend the surface of what we can protect at the endpoint. And last, but certainly not least, we're going to take our endpoint protection model to the broader picture of where we are today, but incorporating endpoint protection into our extended detection and response strategy. So endpoint is much more than endpoint in that sense. It's part of that broader picture that correlates data from the endpoint with our firewalls, our MFA solutions, our Wi-Fi. That's the evolution from the zero trust approach at the endpoint, and the endpoint, Don mentioned it as well, is where most of the data we want to protect resides, to looking at things from that broader lens of combined and extended detection response platform, which we call threats. One of the operators I want to bring to inspire how we're going to talk about the current threat landscape in relation to WatchGuard's endpoint security model is this concept that was made infamous by Donald Rumsfeld more than 20 years ago, of the unknown unknowns. By that time, the concept had been used already, amazingly, in relation to the aeronautical industry. But it's the fundamental assumption that there are outcomes that we cannot control. So those unknown unknowns are the assumption, or bring the concept of assuming that there are things that we have no knowledge, even no knowledge, that we don't know. So that context that was opposed to the known knowns, the things that we know, which is associated, if you look at the right side, with a sort of conscious competence. So we're conscious of what exists, and we have competence to deal with it. The known unknowns, which is a sort of knowing that there are things out there that you don't know. So being conscious of where you cannot reach, the outcomes that we can predict. But and this was the kick of the whole quote. Throughout the history of the country and the other free countries, the latter category of the unknowns is the one that tends to be difficult or tends to be tricky. Well, this is certainly true if we talk about the history of endpoint protection. When we talk about the evolution of endpoint protection, it all started, think antivirus. These days we talk about endpoint protection for the longest time with the antivirus. The thing that got, and I mentioned it already, the thing that got the antivirus industry in trouble early on, in the sense that you had to develop better technology, was that endpoint security was pretty much based on that conscious competence, the knowing what you know, and also being able to tackle it at, and I also want to associate this operator as well, at the pre-execution stage. So if you know something is malicious, you're going to prevent that binary from running, got to prevent that document from opening, got to prevent that script from executing. And the technologies that were associated with this were existed over the years, or were developed, or were evolved over the years. They were started with malware signatures, then it brought URL reputation, in the sense that if we already know a URL to be source of malicious binaries or malicious code, we're not going to prevent access, or we are going to prevent access to that URL. And then heuristics, the same thing, sort of being able to build or to anticipate a variation of things that you know, or that you don't know exactly like that, but you know that they can be associated with characteristics of malware that you already know. And also the nihilist rule sets based on behavior also, which are still pretty much technologies that are built in endpoint security products these days. So I don't mean that knowing what you know, or that conscious competence, is not something that's completely outdated in the way that the industry does endpoint security. In fact, it's the quickest and it's the most effective way to provide protection. So you do it at a pre-execution stage. You already know with a degree of certainty or for sure that that content, that URL is malicious, and you got to prevent access to it. But what happens with the unknowns, whether they are known or unknown? Over the years, you needed other kinds of technology to address that. And that's where we got to start talking about sandbox execution, to executing potentially malicious or suspicious content outside of the real environment, and applying machine learning, AI, all those acronyms or whatever technologies they correspond to, better said, in order to be able to distinguish good from bad. Or the terminology is a lot different throughout the different vendors, but it could be malicious and suspicious. It could be known, unknown. But it's, in the end, the goal is to be able to allow something, because allow a set of events to happen after a file is open or a binary is executed from a set of events that is potentially malicious, and stop that on its tracks. That stopping on its tracks represents something different from what we already know that we know with all those technologies associated with the vendor knowledge. Why? Because they happen at the execution stage. We're not, because we don't know, we need something to happen, whether it is on the real live environment or on a sandbox, to see what it does and to be able to detect that anomalous behavior and stop it. It could be in a second, it could be in less than a second, it could be 3 seconds. Hopefully it's fast enough to prevent that ransomware attack. But what if it isn't? What if that technology fails? Then we have a whole other category of vendor services that may kick in if the technology is not, the AI or ML-based technology is not fast enough. So those technologies, and because those technologies may not decide fast enough, it may, and I'm using the ransomware example here, if you're not fast enough in stopping the encryption action, you may need to roll back. You may need to roll back. Also, you need to have the means to roll back. So we're talking about, when I mentioned vendor services and post-execution, the classical example will be, for example, and a broader example will be a disaster recovery strategy. So probably have to go restore from backups or use snapshots, etc. The technology varies, but the issue with this approach, well, there are two issues. We're already at the post-execution, so something already happened. You're gonna have to take a loss. And the second is, if we're talking about ransomware that actually exfiltrates the data that it's gonna encrypt prior to actually encrypting it on site to use as part of the ransom strategy, not only the fact that the data is encrypted, but also that it's out there and it's going to be published or sold. These, if you already got to this stage, if you are at dealing with things at this point in the attack, well, at the post-execution stage, taking that loss and taking the responsibility that that your data is already out there, whether you choose or you can pay the ransom or not, we're already in trouble. So we went from that 30-year problem of relying on technologies that were most about that conscious competence of the known knowns to getting to a post-execution stage where you need a disaster recovery strategy, which you need in any case. But the thing is, it's a strategy that you don't want to utilize. Well, the association with this and with Zero Trust is that, and you still see it pretty much out there across different technologies and different vendors, is that this is still a trust but verify approach. So anything that is not dealt with at the pre-execution stage, even if it's dealt with at the sandbox, at a sandbox and not an actual live environment, something needed to be executed, something needed to happen in order for these technologies to detect anomalous behavior and stop it. And if the technology is not good enough, or if we're dealing with outcomes that we cannot predict, hence the concept of the Rumsfeld matrix of unknown unknowns, you are likely going to end up in a situation where, like I said, you're going to have to take a level of loss. So the approach that we took specifically, and the approach that the industry, or that led the industry to be talking so much about zero trust, is that you're going to need to go back to that pre-execution stage. You're going to need to go back to developing technologies and finding ways to deal with potential threats before they have a chance to execute. Whether it is on a live environment, on a sandbox, for something to happen outside the environment where your data resides, that can assess to if something should be allowed to execute or not, if it's not yet known. Well, this, in our approach in WatchGuard and in the way that we do endpoint security, is called Zero Trust Application Service. I'm going to describe it in a bit more detail, but it's the way that we distinguish in the pre-execution stage without needing to allow unknown, potentially malicious content to execute generically, the way that we're able to distinguish good that should be allowed to execute from malware that is potentially unknown, classified as such on the spot, and that will not allow execution, not in that endpoint, not in the other endpoints in your environment, but also not in any endpoint that we protect around the world. And then what happens when goodware, only goodware, assuming we can fix that problem, is allowed to execute? Well, a lot can happen, because I'm sure you've been hearing about living off the land, utilizing operating system components, utilizing quote unquote goodware to perform attacks that are driven by technologies and strategies and tactics and techniques that do not, in some cases, utilize malware. Well, if we only allow goodware to run, we're still allowing that huge window of opportunity for our actors to base their attacks and focus their efforts on attacks that utilize goodware. And the numbers on that are staggering, as I'm going to show you in a second. For that, we have a different kind of approach that we deliver as a service. It's threat hunting. It's the monitoring of everything that happens or may happen in the environment from the point where only goodware, through Zero Trust, only goodware is allowed to run in an environment that we protect. So that's why I said that's how we deal with everything else. So Zero Trust application service is about files. Threat hunting is about the fileless, the living off the land, the malwareless vector.
Let me ask you this, Rui, and this is a concern that I've heard expressed by a lot of people on that prior slide, is in terms of Zero Trust, the concern we hear the most frequently is, well, what about, hey, I have a television camera system I use in my network called 3X Logic, which is unusual software, or I run this closer's choice for my title company, or I run these other non-widespread, people like they assume Office is known, and these maybe people have heard of other pieces of software, but hey, I run this graphic editor, or I run this unusual blank door controller. What if they're worried about being slowed down or things getting blocked or creating a hassle factor? What's your response to that in terms of Zero Trust?
And in our approach, a way we have to build trust in applications that may be developed locally or may be developed by smaller vendors is to establish means to implement a sort of pre-trust in new versions of those applications based on characteristics of the application, or more reliably on their digital signatures. So the binaries of those applications can be added in our implementation to a sort of pre-trust stage where we kind of trust or establish a degree of trust in that vendor signature to make the classification process easier and faster. Also, one of the things that I want to highlight about the way we do this, and that takes us to this, is that the classification that we provide does not, for every single application that is run in an endpoint that we protect, is not limited to that endpoint, it's not limited to that client, is not limited in any way, except to the millions of sensors that we have out there.
Right.
When we
so
classify,
your whole database of trusted apps just continues to grow exponentially as your team takes these apps in, ingests them, and whitelist them or test them, and you build those signatures out. So the more of this that gets deployed, the stronger and the faster the whitelisting becomes.
That is correct. Every application that we classify, that classification, that's why I came up with this world spinning. That classification benefits the entire community, the entire installed base with our agent and our sensor deployed. There's no application classification that is done exclusively for an endpoint or exclusively for a client. And that makes that process to be faster. Plus the fact that most of what we classify and the turnaround for what we classify from unknown to either good or bad is performed automatically. So we're based on classifying all running processes in the endpoints. That means that no binary, no running process, no library, no DLL will execute unless it is trusted. So, and I'm going to show you how this translates to the experience.
Thank you. Good answer.
In case you're asking, Don, but it is, all of this, like I mentioned, is done at pre-execution. So there's no way you're going to be allowed to execute something that we haven't classified. Not because it's suspicious. I want to eliminate the concept of suspicious from this, because suspicious is an assumption of a degree of maliciousness that ever exists. We simply are in a situation where we have to suspend execution. We're not denying execution. We're temporarily suspending execution of something that we should not allow because we've never seen it before. So these behaviors, or the behaviors of what would happen after that bind is executed, are verified in real time. That means that admins don't have to investigate anything, in the sense that we upload that application that we just suspended execution, and we're going to provide the service in Zero Trust application service of classifying it. That means that there's a turnaround time. Everything happens in the backend, outside the endpoint. It's not a micro sandbox that you have in your environment or even resides in each endpoint. It's in our backend. In 99.98% of all the applications that we classify in an automated way. That means the turnaround time from unknown to either goodware and should be allowed to execute from that moment on, or like it often happens, new malware, whether that corresponds to a new payload using a brand new technique or just a variation of something that we already know that is put together and packaged in most cases just to avoid detection. Well, that's going to be minutes in 99.98% of the case. But we still have work for our analysts. We classify about these days 300 to 350,000 files a day. So 0.02% is when the automated system cannot decide, and that will deliver the sample and the results of the automated sandboxing results to an actual analyst to classify that file. The turnaround time will be larger, obviously, because there's human analysis involved in this, and that turns it, by the way, into a real service. But in those 0.02%, we, in most cases, know it's bad. We're just going to determine how bad it is to be able to classify it in a way that not only flags it as malicious, but also automates remediation if that sample is being run in an environment that we're protecting somewhere else that does not have this service, that does not have the service attached to it. So the result of the classification benefits, like I said, the entire community of the entire install base in the entire community of endpoints protected with this service, even the ones that are not directly benefiting from it. So that's what we do and have to deal with files. And I told you I'll describe the experience. Our clients know the difference between these two really well. On the left side, you're in conscious competence, and I'll keep recovering the Rumsfeld matrix. You know that is malicious, and if you detected it, and you are going to remove it. Not allow it to execute, we're going to remove it. On the right side, we have the corresponding unknown item detected zero-trust approach. You got a pop-up not because we know it to be malicious, but because this executable file, this binary, is attempting to run, and it's gonna start the process of being submitted for classification. So every time that you try to execute in this exact application while the classification process is running in the background, which typically would take minutes, you are going to get this notification locally. Of course, the notifications and how they look, they're configurable from an admin perspective, but it's just to illustrate how it looks from a UI perspective. It's very different on how you get notified that something is not going to be allowed to execute and delete it because we already know it to be malicious, or when we are at zero-trust based suspension of execution of an item that we've never seen in that endpoint, we've never seen in that client, we never saw in the millions of endpoints that we protect and have live data in real time. So unknown items detected are not going to be allowed execution until, like the pop-up says, it's a 100% trusted application. So I just want to give you also a perspective of how well this has worked for us in our end. So infections in endpoints with our endpoint security protection up and running from when we released this, and by the way, we released this zero trust application service approach with the Panda product back in March 2015. And you can see, or we can see and appreciate that the reduction in the number of infections that had to be escalated to our labs with endpoints that are actually being protected by our sensors has reduced significantly. And when we're evaluating the output of this service, I want you to focus on the fact that we're talking about file-based malware only, because could end my presentation right now and say, okay, it works really well for us. I could be selling, right? This approach works really well for us. That's how we solve the problem of file-based malware, or malware generically, by not allowing unknown files to run until we determine if they're good, because if we determine that they're bad, they didn't run in the first place, and that's the whole idea. But there's part of the picture that we're missing. Still, for file-based malware, this worked really well for us. In fact, going from that trust to verify and jumping to going back to pre-execution and adopting a strategy of suspending unknown applications to run in the endpoints that we protect until we had a chance in our backend to determine if they're good or bad, worked really well to get rid of the bulk of the file-based malware. But what's the story here? Well, the story is about living off the land. And I'll illustrate it with data that comes from our own Internet Security Report for Q3 last year. We're just finalizing the Q4 report. So this is, well, these three aspects are what we are really worried about, and what leads our strategy in not only the built-in threat hunting service that we are already providing, but also the extended detection response, that bigger picture that we're going to end our description of our strategy on, and also the managed detection and response services that we're adding, and the industry is adding. You probably heard of that as well. The concern is living off the land attacks, and it starts with using remote management tools, and to avoid being detected, to carry out attacks, to avoid being detected by endpoint security solutions. So we described in our Internet Security Report an authorized team viewer that was utilized in a mass support scam to allow an attacker or the attackers to get remote access to victims. So this is a good example of living off the land. We tend to think of living off the land as just operating system components. It could be just a commercial application that is deployed in some way as part of a social engineering strategy, and that will, with authorization from the user at the endpoint, will allow the attacker to have remote access and then deploy whatever they intend from that moment on. So we're not going to block TeamViewer, not going to block the TeamViewer agent. We have no reason to not trust the TeamViewer agent. It's digitally signed, etc. And if you look at the endpoint data, if you look at the, as we call it, endpoint telemetry coming from TeamViewer executions, it's difficult to distinguish it from any malicious use of TeamViewer from a non-malicious use, except if we're actually tracking what's going to happen beyond the simple execution of TeamViewer. But the point is, the entry vector is there, right? That's how it all starts. You don't need compromised passwords. You don't need brute force attacks. You just get an application, a commercial application, in the context of a scam, utilizing social engineering, and you have a point of entry. And then we see that threat actors, and we already have access, right? We're just making it outrageous with utilizing TeamViewer. What happens next? So threat actors are pivoting from script-based attacks. Scripts are already pretty much in the realm, in the current endpoint security technologies, in the realm of the conscious competence, or at least the conscious incompetence, with technologies being developed and very active to address it, to other living off the land techniques. Utilizing Windows operating system, and specifically Windows binaries, for living off the land attacks increased in Q3 alone 32%. So this is the concern. But still, script-based attacks, not talking about those binaries or those libraries that we classify within the Zero-Trust application system. So beyond that, script-based attacks are still 60% of the total. Of course, we have signatures in our traditional technologies in the stack to block scripts that we already know that are malicious. But again, conscious competence is not everything, because you obviously know what you know and you have a degree of certainty in blocking it. But how do we address a script-based attack that's utilizing a script or a technique that is based, or a technique based on scripting that we've never seen. So it works. That's why most likely it's still 56% of the total. And zero-day malware represents almost 70%, 69% of all malware that we see. That means that if it's 0 day, if it's still not, if it corresponds, if it's still unknown, so if we're at the realm of the known unknowns or the unknown unknowns, and that's a big one, we are going to need better technology, better models. You're going to need behavioral analysis to track this, or it may also be based in software vulnerabilities that the vendors, and that's also part of the definition of 0 day, that the vendors of those applications still don't know about. So we definitely need evolved models, you need behavioral analysis, and we need to combine that with the zero trust approach. So living off the land attacks are definitely our main concern now. So how do we address that? So with the other side of the coin, threat hunting service. So these living off the land, fileless, malwareless attacks are the most difficult to detect, and they make it easier for those cyber criminals to attack stealthily. And it could just start with that TeamViewer implementation. That's considered a living off the land attack that then deploys everything without resorting to malware, with utilizing PowerShell to deploy attacks or deploy shellcode and memory, etc. So that's the kind of thing that we address with our threat hunting service. We're going to find those attackers using those living off the land techniques. We're going to monitor for lateral movement when they get in through that TeamViewer implementation, and then they move to other endpoints or through other methods. I'm just illustrating it with the TeamViewer. On compromised credentials are used in the context of that lateral movement, for example, and we're going to model user behavior also to identify malicious employees that are able, by the definition, they're on the inside, quote unquote, and they have a level of access and a level of system rights that allows them to use the operating system and monitor applications. How do we do this? We can't do this without building a baseline that is based on real-time endpoint monitoring. I'll recover what I said previously. What happens when we know, or we've had things under control by only allowing goodware to execute? We're not just gonna forget about monitoring that goodware execution because we deemed that binary good at some point in time. No, we're gonna do exactly the opposite. We're gonna keep monitoring that goodware and establish pattern and deviation. The way we do it in WatchGuard and with our strategy to do threat hunting and address living off the land is out of a 12-month data lake. That means that we have 12 months of endpoint telemetry. That means application activity, network activity from an endpoint perspective, interactions with the operating system. That means interactions with the registry, interactions with the file system. For each endpoint that we protect, 12 months. And we have several ways to deliver that data to our clients independently if they want to have access to it, or if they want to integrate that data in a CM platform, etc. But that is the same exact parameter we utilize on our backend to provide the threat hunting service. You cannot do this. You cannot address living off the land, fileless, malwareless, without constantly monitoring application execution in the endpoint. In case of a validated breach, what we call an indicator of attack, which was confirmed out of indicators we get from the backend as an early stage of an attack, we are going to alert the customer through our solution. And that's just an example of how we do it for example, a memory execution of a script with PowerShell. So a good example of a PowerShell attack where you can see on the left side, on the other details, you can see the obfuscated command line, when in fact, on the advanced investigation report that we issue, we see that the Dakota command line is actually using regserve32 to download a binary, to download a library. So if you didn't know, regserve32 could download files. Well, it can, and it's often utilized as part of a living off the land attack with PowerShell. So threat hunting, and I want to highlight this, is not only part of the strategy. It's not only part of how we protect endpoints, in the sense that we cannot forget the living off the land, the fileless and malwareless vendor, and we do not want to associate it with an optional service. Threat hunting is part of this equation, and it's a built-in WatchGuard service. It's part of. It's not a separate module. It's not a separate service. It's something that is built into every license. And I want to highlight this because there's no protection model, according to the way we do things, at least, that does not need to account for implementing zero trust for file execution and then implementing post-execution monitoring, threat hunting to deal with the living off the land vector. So there's no strategy without those components. And what I wanted to bring today is a simplification of how we implement them and how we make them work together. So how did that translate to our endpoint security solutions? Well, we have an entry-level antivirus that does not have these services built in, because it's made or it's built to be able to be executed in an environment where, for example, an existing endpoint detection response product or a set of services already exist, but we have a stack of or a portfolio of products that leverage the combination of these two services, the Zero Trust application service and the threat hunting service. The EDR product that is meant to built to run alongside an existing, another endpoint security product, what we call EPDR, which is our star product, which is a combination of antivirus, all those conscious competence technologies, all those very effective technologies that are based on what we already know that we know, combined with the EDR services, with the Zero Trust application service and the threat hunting service. So the combination of both is what we call endpoint protection, detection, response. And then recently, we released a more advanced version with remote shell capabilities, with integration with STIX and YARA rules for IOC indicator of compromise, external indicator of compromise detection, which is aimed to be utilized by clients that have dedicated security teams and analysts. So it's something between having your combination of antivirus and EDR services and leveraging your own threat hunting platform. So something in between that allows advanced investigation and mitigation features. Not more protection, but more of the investigation and mitigation capabilities. And I mentioned extensibility. Extensibility is allowing also that agent to have more features that are outside the core services that we've been talking about, to deal with file-based malware and to deal with the living off the land vector. Also, I mentioned in the context of living off the land, 0 days that are based on application vulnerabilities that are not yet known by the vendor. But what about the ones that are? So we can extend each one of our agents with patch management abilities to patch operating system and third parties. We can do help with full encryption, managing full encryption for hard drives, and even removable storage for Windows and Mac devices. And the two additional modules, we call them modules, that allow our clients to consume and leverage the endpoint telemetry that we utilize, that prime matter that we utilize to provide the Zero Trust application service and the threat hunting service. Advanced reporting, you can see 12 months, that 12-month data lake of data from all your endpoints, application execution, network data, interactions with the registry, all malware alerts, and all reports. If you do not have a CM or a data analytics platform, but if you want to integrate that same telemetry with an existing CM, data analytics platform, or any other third-party platform that you can enrich the analytics with the wealth of our endpoint telemetry, we have a seam feeder connector that allows that integration. So our solutions expand sort of horizontally, going from just an antivirus to advanced investigation and remediation EDR features for analysts, but also vertically with being able to leverage that agent for patch management, for full encryption, or for consuming or integrating our endpoint telemetry in third-party platforms. All of that through the same, I like to highlight this, through the same management platform and through a single agent. And now off to the bigger picture. So the strategy, the combined strategy of the Zero Trust application service and the threat hunting service are today in our strategy a part of something bigger. So in the telemetry, you see it illustrated on the left side, you have telemetry that pertains to known good data or known bad data. So everything that we end up associating with behaviors of applications that we classified as malicious, or behaviors that we associated with actually confirming and releasing an indicator of attack that we built into an alert that we sent to the client. All of that is today integrated with the equivalent coming from, for example, network security, where you don't have telemetry, but you have logs pertaining, informational logs about net flows. You have known bad data, so we have logs about detections that we were able to perform at the firewall level, even for endpoints that are behind that firewall, when that is not necessarily the case. But today what we do is we integrate these, and this is at the core. I won't bore you with the definition of XDR, extended detection response, but it's at the core of what that means. Normalizing, integrating that data, and making that data translate into something that makes the products work together. So we ingest telemetry from the endpoints as we ingest logs from our firewalls. We normalize that data, build it into a common format where we're able to establish correlation. And correlation means that at a higher level, at an XDR level, what you see are not just isolated detections, either from the firewall or from the endpoints, are combined detections that paint the whole picture of what happened and where was it blocked at, and what were the components that were involved with it. Which firewall of the ones that we're managing did that file come from, and where it was stopped? Was it at the firewall level? Was it at the endpoint? And at the same time, prioritize the attention needed to deal with it. And the attention doesn't mean that we're just issuing alerts in our XDR and you necessarily need to take actions. But the prioritization also helps you in determining that you may need a different configuration on your endpoint security or a different configuration on your firewalls for those alerts to have a lower priority or to be dealt with more proactively in the future. So if you don't have extended detection response, you can only do it separately at the firewall level or at the endpoint level. With the XDR, you can do it at the higher level. And I'm going to illustrate that in a minute. So extended detection response is a platform where that unification, where that aggregation and correlation happens. Today, it's about integrating endpoint and firewall, but very soon it will be also about integrating multi-factor authentication and our secure Wi-Fi platforms. And issuing, again, alerts or issuing incidents, as we call them in this context, that contain correlated information for every product or every detection or every log that is involved in that particular incident. So it's about delivering extended detection and response across environments, users, and devices. So identifying the user involved, and also identifying the devices, whether it's just the endpoint or it is an endpoint behind a firewall, and we're going to identify both. So we normalize information to respond to threats across security layers, paint that bigger picture, and allow you to take decisions. Also, something that is critical to sitting at that sort of incident responder role is prioritization. And we do it with threat scores and threat levels. It's really easy to flip a switch and organize what we want you to look at based on a score that indicates priority. And also its context, details, contextualized, and a picture that is actionable for the threat surface that we're exposing within each incident, which means that we're going to describe what happened, we're going to describe which actions were taken, but we're going to allow actions to be taken from the context of the incident itself. So this is just an example. I'm going to illustrate it with a couple other examples, but you see in the context of extended detection and response, and in the context of, for example, web cross-site scripting attack, we're identifying, you see it on the right side, the program, in this case it was Edge, the browser, the connection. We're identifying the firebox, the firewall that this connection went through, and we're identifying the endpoint. So we have all the elements in the incident where if you're not utilizing an XDR panel, you would have different logs that will indicate you the same occurrence of the access to this website and the website web cross scripting attack. And also on the left side, when you see the threat details and the description of what happened, you have actionable. You have actionable intelligence and the ability to deploy actions from the incident itself, whether it is blocking the IP that originated this detection, isolating the computer that used Edge in the context of this attack, or kill the process. In this case, it's just kill the browser and the risk that is associated with it. And we see the risk there is medium, in the sense that the intrusion was detected with the Firebox IPS engine. Let's look at other examples. Any questions, Don, that you see in the?
I think you're doing great. Yeah, I think we're all good. I think one of the key issues, though, was, explaining specifically talking about threat hunting, because these living off the land attacks and PowerShell specifically, super dangerous. And just like you pointed out, that's not a file. That's not it's a trusted service. It's required to be on the PC. And there's other examples beyond PowerShell, obviously. But I think threat hunting and having having an endpoint protection platform that is backed by live human intelligence. Of course, you guys are using, AI and machine learning to filter that down, so you're only looking at the stuff that really needs looking at. But I think that's an absolutely critical part of it. And kudos to WatchGuard for just making that, embedded in there and not charging for it.
It's the only way to go. That was one of the message. We can't charge. The thing is, we can charge for a component which we think is critical to providing adequate protection, right? If we're just focused on the file vector, and if we have the threat hunting as an extra, that's half of the equation, right? It's half of the protection. If we're just doing threat hunting without providing zero trust application execution or even all the antivirus features to be able to address the known knowns, that conscious competence of the intelligence about malware out there over the years, that wouldn't be adequate protection either. That's my point.
Yeah, exactly. What are we doing here? Are we going to try to protect it or not? And I think that that kind of holistic overview of protection and really looking out for all these people, because the last thing we want to have happen is for anyone, mid-sized enterprise, small business, or even large client to buy these technologies and not have the protection that they need. So I think the zero trust paradigm shift and moving into zero trust is really the only answer, and then backing it up with threat hunting and all the other things are, that's really the right approach. Not saying that we're the only ones to do it, but I think that's the right way to do it.
Let me show you an example. I've got an interesting illustration that while PowerShell and there's other things, I've got an example here of what is the other thing. So you can look at, let's sit at the incident responder chair with XDR for a bit. We're going to look at yesterday's 159 incidents. Of course, this is like a test environment. And so it's actually a live environment, a honeypot environment, in fact. So a lot more incidents that what you should expect, depending on your organization, of course. They said it's spent over the course of a year, but it's just an illustration, right? You see the criticality level, so the risk score and the risk levels we associate, and that also translates into what we, like I mentioned, what we want the attention of the incident responder to focus on, or the administrator in general. Incident status. So there's also a status associated with incidents that we generate at that broader picture XDR level. New, the ones that are read, and the ones that you can archive manually or automatically. You're going to see that in a second. So if you look at, there's a way that you can associate them. Date, we're looking at yesterday, and you can associate with risk, which was my point. So the vector, the number 10, so this is the highest. If you look at the risks, you have filters, and you look at risk levels. So critical for 9 and 10, high, medium, and low, to establish a more fine differentiation within a level. There's a specific score inside the level. So the top is, and this is the factor besides PowerShell that I wanted to mention, Don, is RDP. So last year, RDP accounted for the entry vector of 30% of all the attacks that had to be escalated to the highest level of our lab because it happened in an endpoint that we protect. So whether that was caused by misconfiguration or because our technologies failed, that's not at stake here. I'm already saying that we have to deal with an attack that happened in an endpoint that we protected. The entry vector was RDP. So the top, the 10 critical are going to be, or is in this example, an invalid RDP login. You see that we're not identifying the firewall here. This connection went through. We're already assuming that the RDP is exposed. And that's not a problem in itself, or it could be a problem in itself. Well, that's probably part of what this is considered critical. And it doesn't mean that anything happened that they got in. It means that we've identified an RDP invalid login attempt. Nothing happened, but it's stand. Why? Because RDP is exposed, and 2, because there is a repeated set of attempts to get in through RDP. 30% of all the escalated top level attack cases last year were based on RDP as an entry vector. So you say a threat got invalid logins, event was detected, so no action was taken here, but you can take recommended actions, which either is isolating the device while you change the password, or let's be optimistic, implement an MFA, for example, if you don't have it, or act at a different level, block the attacker's IP on all the fireboxes, on all the firewalls that you're managing. Okay? And you're going to take this action immediately and perform it.
That's really cool stuff. I appreciate you showing that, and it's very informative about how easy it is to use that interface, but also just the technology behind it and how it's protecting the endpoint against these, morphing and escalating attacks, especially living off the land and the rest of it. So once you're in a zero trust environment and you can't execute, encryption attacks and so on because it won't let you, then living off the land becomes the next frontier, and we've got a solution for that with active threat hunting. So I know we're basically out of time. Is there anything you want to say in parting, Rui, before we conclude?
Well, I just wanted to show quickly an example of a download of a virus. So a download of a malicious component that was blocked by the firebox, but that does not keep you from getting an incident that has a different level of priority, because an automatic response was taken, and it's highlighted here that your concern with this is relative to the risk level of the risk score that we're assigning it, because we acted on it by blocking it at the gateway. But still, you have identified the firebox and the actual endpoint behind it that requested and downloaded, or attempted to download, in this case, a file. And always actions in case you consider this, even if it was blocked by the gateway, if you look at this file and you consider this component to be suspicious enough, for example, for this kind of user to be doing, you can immediately isolate the device. So it's about getting combined and aggregated and integrated bigger picture incidents. It's about combining the levels or your layers of security in the information that you get in each incident, and it's being able to act accordingly at the different levels.
Awesome.
Automatic response might be taken, but there's always automated actions that you can take as part of your response to this specific incident. That's what this extended detection response strategy is all about, and where we are currently focused most of our efforts.
Yeah, totally. Well, excellent content today, Rui. We appreciate you joining us. All of our guests, we appreciate you joining us. That concludes the content. We will stick around, Rui and Brittany and I, for just a moment. Please feel free to use the chat or questions. If you'd like to ask anything in parting, we'll make sure we get you an answer offline. I'll follow up with you personally. As a reminder, we had recorded this. We are going to edit it for content and then upload it to our YouTube channel by tomorrow. So that'll be available to watch on demand or to send to your friends. And as always, we appreciate you joining us, and we're grateful for your support. And I hope you have a great rest of your week and a nice weekend as well. We'll stick around for just a couple minutes in case there's any questions in parting. Thank you, Rui.
Thank you. Thanks for your time.